Hey there, good people. Big Heavy coming at you from the acoustically and illuminationally inferior garage, but it's a rainy day outside and wanted to give you a first charge, first tank, whatever you want to call it, report on the new KQI3 MAX. So ran the battery down to 38%. Didn't get the range on the box. That's not to be unexpected. Frankly, the range was a bit lower than I thought. I will put some stats on the screen. Won't focus too much on the range since this was the initial charge. I probably had a little bit of the kid on Christmas syndrome when I got this. Took it out of the box, let it charge for a little bit, then goofed around, rode down the street a few times, and then charged it up to 100%. So don't want to read too much into this initial battery, but I want to give you some initial thoughts, how the scooter's performed, likes and dislikes, again, off the initial 18-ish miles. Let's start with the riding experience. First off, it's pretty good. There's some big tires on this scooter. It's not a scooter with suspension, obviously, but the roads around here are pretty decent, and the ride's nice. I took it on some sidewalk, and you feel the bumps. I wouldn't want to go more than 5-ish miles over sidewalk. Just going over those expansion joints over and over again would be a little tough on your wrists. You do feel that vibration coming through the handlebars, which again, not unexpected there on a scooter without suspension. The big tires do help. I have heard that you can air those down a little bit to get a little bit more of a suspension effect. I do have them at the manufacturer recommended 45 to 50 PSI. So it's not enough to bother me at this point, so I probably won't do much with adjusting the tire pressure, but something to be aware of if you were on pretty bad streets. You may want to think about going with something with suspension or considering airing down those tires a little bit. Other thing I noticed kind of as a general comment on the ride quality, really like how quiet this thing is. You get this nice little futuristic whirring when you're accelerating, or you have the throttle pegged when you're going up a hill or something like that. But in general, once you're kind of up to cruising speed, there's very little noise, and it's surprisingly quiet. Even, if I've got my bicycle kind of perfectly tuned, just oiled or waxed the chain, the thing's, running perfectly, there's still that drivetrain noise, and it fades into the background and isn't noticeable, but the almost total absence of noise on this scooter at cruising speed is pretty cool. It'd be fun to take this on, like a nice scenic bike path or something like that. You could really get lost in your surroundings and just kind of enjoy the peace and quiet of having essentially a noiseless machine cruising along. Other thing that I was interested in discovering and potentially a little bit worried about was hill performance. There are some pretty big hills around here. I think that ate into my battery life initially. I did take this scooter on a few errands, took it down to our little, local area with some restaurants and stuff. And there's a couple big hills through there, and it made it up just fine. It wasn't flying up the hills, which I, kind of expected. The speedometer went down to an indicated, 7, 8, 9-ish miles an hour versus the indicated 22 that'll hit cruising on a flat road. But it did drag my big old butt up the hills. This scooter does have one of the more powerful motors in the new range, and I think the 3 to 500-ish watt motor seems to be the top end for a single motor scooter. If you had bigger hills or you really wanted to crank up those hills, you would need to go with a dual motor scooter. I don't find the speed that it takes me up to be all that troubling. Although if I did have a very hilly route or a lot of hills, I might consider going that dual motor route, because you do go from 22 miles an hour at cruise to 9 miles an hour. So you're going about 30% of your max speed up those hills, which is obviously noticeable and might be problematic to you if you do have to ride up a lot of hills and you want to get up them pretty quickly. In terms of other ride-related experiences, I did take this out at night a couple times. There's a lot in the product marketing and some of the reviews that maybe seem a little bit more interested in focusing solely on the positive around the headlight on this scooter. It is this kind of cool circular light. Everyone makes a big deal out of that. Looks pretty neat. I think from a safety perspective, it's unusual enough that people notice you a little bit more when they're coming towards you. From a riding at night perspective, I would call it kind of minimally functional. Puts out enough light that you can see. It's not a very long projection, and you could obviously adjust the headlight up and down. But the problem with that is there's a pretty defined cutoff at the top of the beam as well as at the bottom of the beam. So, in terms of, if you think of looking in front of you on the road as like a 0 to, let's call it 100, viewpoint during the day, I would say the headlight covers maybe 20-ish% of that, maybe more like 15-ish%. So you're either going to, if you tilt it down too much, you'll get a nice view of the road in front of you, but you're going to kind of overrun your headlight. You're not going to be able to see very far in front of you to the point where it might be a bit unsafe. Or if you move it up quite a bit, it's not powerful enough to reach way into the distance, and then you lose some of that visibility in front of you. So if I was going to do a lot of, serious night riding, and I wanted to go at kind of full speed, which again is that indicated 22-ish miles an hour, probably in reality it's more like 20, I would think about maybe upgrading the headlight, or I'm also going to try riding with one of the, I have a bunch of little headlamps for camping. That might be enough to kind of fill in some of the missing space, and would be a little bit cheaper and easier than either modifying the scooter by replacing the headlight, or trying to figure out how to mount a new one on here and tap into the wiring and all that stuff. Another couple things I wanted to hit on, I did mention that the throttle's a little snatchy. I still haven't tried turning the scooter to non-kick to start mode. So, you have to give it a few kicks and get up to 4 miles an hour before the throttle will work. I still haven't mastered that, particularly if I'm crossing a street or I'm in some kind of traffic situation where you're focusing on multiple things. It is a little hard to get that timing perfect where you kick it enough and then mash the throttle and you go. I tend to, do one kick, mash the throttle. It doesn't go, I kick again, and then I have to remember to take your finger totally off the throttle, hit that again. So that's kind of inconvenient, but when I did turn off the kick to start feature, if you don't just ever so gently hit that throttle, you're going to take off pretty aggressively. My hope is that that's something they can fix in firmware, because if you do put the scooter into learning mode where it restricts your top speed, the throttle is quite functional. In that case, you can, give it a quarter of the throttle, you'll take off, nicely in a pretty controlled manner, versus, you give it a quarter of the throttle when it's in unrestricted mode, and it can kind of jump out from under you since it takes off so quickly. So my hope is that they can fix that in software, because it is a little bit challenging to modulate the throttle when it's in kind of full speed mode. The other thing that's a little challenging that took me a bit to get used to, but ultimately I like quite a bit, is there is regenerative braking on this scooter. So you can set it, you can set it from minimal to maximal to turning it totally off. But if you take your hand off the throttle, you don't hit any brakes, you'll slow down. And at minimum, I find it to be a pretty nice controlled slowdown. If I'm, say, 50, 40-ish feet from a stop sign, I want to slow to a stop, I can take my hands off the throttle. The scooter slows in a pretty nice controlled manner, and it'll just about come to a stop without hitting the brake. So that's fantastic, very similar to an electric vehicle or something like that. Where things get a little troubling is if you grab the right brake, I think it immediately applies maximum regenerative braking before it even starts to use the actual mechanical brakes, which from one hand, great, save your brake pads, do all the wonderful things around regenerative braking. On the other hand, it comes on pretty strong. You go from this light regenerative braking to, kind of full tilt. And it's a little bit jarring. The first time I grabbed a little bit of brake, I was expecting sort of a linear braking type feeling, but I went from, kind of 0 to, full on, let's throw the boat anchor out. And that was a little bit unexpected, a little bit jarring. So now I've kind of learned to lean back a little bit. Deck of the scooter does have that nice ramp in front, so you can kind of put a foot out and brace yourself a little bit so you're not unnecessarily torquing the bars or risking throwing yourself off, but it is a bit jarring. And again, it's something I wish they could modulate. This one, I don't necessarily know if that's fixable in software. I think, I've been in enough cars that try and do regenerative braking well, and it usually doesn't work that well. If you've ever driven an early Toyota Prius, the thing feels like it has, brakes that are blocks of wood attached to your feet. They have no feel. They're just sort of terrible. So it's been a hard problem to solve in the automotive space. It's got to be an even more difficult problem to solve in the scooter space. And if you're aware of it, it's something you can mitigate. But I have considered, do I turn off the regenerative? Because if I did have something unexpected happen and just grabbed a little bit of brake and wasn't prepared for that high amount of braking that comes on with that little bit of brake application, it might throw you off and it might cause you a problem. A few other noteworthy items. I like the app a lot. It seems pretty well designed. It's been reasonably well functioning. I always have mixed feelings on apps because who knows what kind of data is being sent about me to, some mothership somewhere doing God knows what with it, particularly since they're gathering location data so they can get speed and all that sort of thing. It does give you a nice ride history, it does seem to have pretty nice animations. The tutorial thing I thought was a non-issue, despite some people on the internet saying it was, horrible and difficult and frustrating. I didn't have any problems getting connected to the scooter. I know some people have. I find the configuration options quite nice. There's a little bit of a lock option you can put in the app, which basically just will cause the scooter to display red when you tap the button. And if somebody tries to move it, it'll make some noise and drag the brakes a little bit. Obviously not enough to stop a legitimate thief, but I think it's enough to keep kids from goofing around with it if you're leaving it in your garage or leaving it out somewhere for a few minutes. So app I found to be pretty nice, and I do like that ride history feature. So winding this up for the first tank review, things I would change or modify. I'd love to see them fix that throttle. I think that's imminently fixable in software. I'm not a scooter designer engineer, so I may be talking out of my rear on that, but since it does work so reasonably well in the normal mode, I would hope that they could fix that through software in the longer mode. I'm going to try that headlamp trick, particularly, it gets a little dark around here when there's no moon and we're in winter. So we'll see if that makes the lighting a little more effective. If not, I want to see if there's some sort of drop-in lamp replacement. I do like the clean look of the scooter. I do like how they have that light nicely integrated. So if you could put something a little brighter on there without upsetting the overall aesthetic, that would be nice. The other thing I'm thinking of doing is the little latch here that latches into the deck when you fold the scooter. I think might be a nice place to clip a little carabiner, and you could have that to hang a bag. One of the errands I did do was to go out and pick up some lunch at a local restaurant. I brought my backpack, assuming I would throw it in there, but then realized most takeout food is kind of designed to be carried flat versus carried vertically, and I didn't want my sandwich to fall apart in transit. And I noticed, hey, this would be a good place to clip a little clip, and then you could attach your bag on there. So that might be my initial response to how you transport your grub around, since that seems like it'd be a pretty common use case for these guys. So overall, initial impressions pretty positive, like the ride quality, like the design. Getting used to the throttle. The braking thing, still haven't decided if I'll keep the regen on or off. I love it, except when you go to grab the brakes and the application goes from 0 to quite strong. Light leaves a little bit to be desired. Maybe my hopes were too high, since a lot of the reviews hype up how great that headlamp is. And again, don't have a ton of electric scooter experience, so maybe this is the one-eyed man in the land of the blind or something like that. That remains to be seen. But I'll continue to post some reviews. I'm going to try and take some longer trips and have some more thoughts on whether scooters are a viable means of transportation in the suburbs. Until then, Big Heavy saying, ride on. Peace. Ever wonder why every talking head on YouTube asks you to hit the like and subscribe button at the end of their video? You were right, because we're living in a computer simulation. And our benevolent robotic overlords get just a little bit of energy every time you hit that like. So, do me, the rest of civilization, and our benevolent robotic overlords a favor. Mash that subscribe, be kind to each other, keep living your simulated dreams.